Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the screens where David Steinhardt and our chiefs explain how the state came to see the need for juvenile realignment.
What is the measure of success of juvenile justice realignment in California? Did it work? Was it good? Was it the right thing? I would have to say, having been in the trenches with this reform, that it is a major success story. It met almost every goal, really every goal that was laid out for it.
Juvenile justice realignment in California has ushered in significant changes in the way all of us throughout the state do our business. It really marked the incentivization of evidence-based strategies, really using risk and needs assessment to be smarter about who we incarcerate and who we safely treat in the community.
Our philosophy before SB 81 was that we had a continuum of graduated sanctions. And so as a youth would come in our system, we'd put them on supervision. And then, of course, if they would violate or have a new arrest, we automatically elevated them. So we sent a lot of youth to out-of-home placement, and we sent a lot of youth to the California Youth Authority. We didn't feel like there were a lot of resources for us to serve them locally.
It was so compliance driven, and so you measured success on whether or not that kid did what you told them to do, not whether or not that kid was well and healed and wasn't harming the community anymore.
By 1996, the California Youth Authority had reached a population peak of overcrowding with 10,000 young people in institutional space that was built for about 6,000. There were kids in CYA with marijuana offenses, marijuana up to murder.
Being raised in CYA and penal environments, you grow up with the gang mentality, you grow up with the criminal mentality, certain racist and sexist views. My time there was very traumatic. My reentry supports came in the form of a community college counselor, the OPS counselors, people who were authentic, who understood my background, understood my challenges, and chose to address those issues with love and compassion and education, nothing that I had experienced prior to that.
The California Youth Authority by 2007 was a real mess. There were documented incidents of violence. The success of young people who went into the Youth Authority was miserable. They had high recidivism rates, and this had become public information. The cost per kid per year to keep somebody incarcerated in this difficult, troubled institution was $250,000 a year. At the time, the governor was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he was the first governor in 20 years to come out and actually admit that things were wrong and needed to change, and change they did. The decision was made to cut the flow of commitments into the Youth Authority, and it was one that had the counties and the probation chiefs in particular rather worried, because they were being told essentially that you can't send these kids to the Youth Authority anymore. You've got to keep them in local care. The question was, who were those kids and how many would go to the county? Challenge number 2 was money. It was clear that this was never going to happen unless the counties had the resources to handle the shifted caseload.
Senate Bill 81 really gave probation departments for the first time the resources necessary to make this kind of investment into local rehabilitation. It was a realignment of our thinking and our approach to juveniles as well.
It's changed how I think probation officers see youth. I think when you read somebody's history and you can really understand, wow, they were 5 years old when that happened, they were 7 when that happened, they were 9 when that happened, then what they're doing at 15 doesn't seem quite as shocking as it did.
We were able to really learn about trauma and how it impacted our youth. And sadly, 85% of the youth that are in my system have had prior contact in the child welfare system.
To find out how you're feeling.
And so we have trained our staff on adverse childhood experiences, trauma-informed care, and even vicarious trauma, and how it impacts them when you're dealing with youth who have experienced community trauma, neighborhood trauma, abuse, and neglect themselves.
We value data and the importance of data, that we recognize that assessment has an important role in making good decisions, and that probation is an advocate for our youth and families. I'm incredibly proud of not only the investment of our community, but tremendously proud of the partnership that we have with our community agencies that recognize that they share in our obligation and responsibility to make sure that young people get what they need. And what I can tell you is that where we are today is far better than where we were. And our reliance on institutions is far less significant than it was a decade ago.
Probation departments really embraced all of these reforms, and that's why we see today a significant reduction in crime and a significant reduction in incarceration.
With SB 81, we were able to rise to the challenge with juvenile realignment. And I truly believe that that success led to SB 678 at helping to reduce the new revocations to state prison, which then led to AB 109.
Now we're implementing Prop 57 because it's working. And so I think the sky's the limit.
When we have the resources, probation can accomplish anything. I truly believe that. And our moonshot is to actually eliminate the juvenile justice system. And it's not by being soft on crime, but by raising children in such healthy communities and families that they don't turn to drugs, they don't turn to gangs, they don't turn to delinquency.
Lower crime rates, lower incarceration rates, costs saved at the state level, better programming and reentry options for kids at the local level. Those are the markers of youth realignment success at the local level. None of that would have happened without the probation voice and participation in the reform.
Now, please welcome Chief Jim Salio of San Luis Obispo County and President-elect of CPOC.
Good morning. I just love that video. Let's give another round of applause for the participants of that video. That's going to be rolling on YouTube for a long time. As the video highlighted, in 2007, California embarked on a historic mission to completely change the juvenile justice system in our state. While the video touched on it, it is important to understand exactly what juvenile realignment was and what it did for probation departments and the juvenile justice system in California. Due to the many pressures at the time, as David Steinhardt said in the video, the decision was made, things had to change, and change they did. SB 81 was the first realignment of the state juvenile justice responsibilities in California, shifting a population from what was then California Youth Authority to the local halls, and shifting supervision responsibilities of the state to the counties. Sounds very familiar. This was the blueprint for AB 109. However, this did not come without angst from county probation. To be frank, we were scared. We had overcrowding in our juvenile halls. We had a lack of services for youth in our communities. And we were very concerned about taking over state responsibilities. Also, not having the youth authority available to send our most difficult youth was a hard pill to swallow. Evidence-based practices was still in its infancy in many counties, and we felt we were being asked to run before we could even walk. And all this was being proposed with the promise of state funding. Historically, state counties have not had good experiences with receiving state funding. It was all good for a little while, the legislation changed, the leadership changed, and the funding dried up. But in our hearts, we knew that state institutions were not the answer for reforming the juvenile justice system. So we took that leap of faith, and we bet on ourselves, and we bet we could do things differently. We bet in the fact that the state would keep their promise and give us the resources we need to improve our local justice system. We knew we could do the right thing by youth in our community and in our care. And now, 10 years later, I would say we made the right bet. Not only did we succeed in helping improve the juvenile justice system by dropping arrest rates and detention rates, we kept families together, we protected our neighborhoods, and we built a blueprint on how to use evidence-based practices to change behavior, which would later transform the adult system in California. And the state, to their credit, kept their word. After 10 years, we still are receiving the state funding for realignment. The grand experiment that no one thought would work has been a smashing success. Part of the reason for the success of SB 81 was that it was structured in such a way that allowed counties to use the money given to them by the states in needs in ways that were expressly unique to that county. In the past, the state would give us money, but they would always tell us, here's how you have to use the money. This time they gave us the money and said, counties, you're the experts, you do what you need to do. With this money, we were able to fill those critical gaps that existed in our local communities. We were able to accomplish great things, like working with youth in schools before they even entered in the juvenile justice system. In San Luis Obispo County, we have a program called Youth in Action, where we're working with kids identified by the local school districts in the elementary and junior high. Our one goal in this program, and it's a very simple goal, is keep these kids out of the juvenile justice system. Programs like this and many others you'll hear about today were really able to become fully operational by the resources provided by SB 81. SB 81 was the catalyst to move California forward to rehabilitate and reform the juvenile justice system in California. SB 81 allowed for a clear continuum of evidence-based services within the juvenile justice system. It allowed DJJ, or the Old California Youth Authority, to restructure itself to be able to serve the most serious youth. It allowed us for funding for prevention and intervention services while allowing DJJ to restructure their delivery system. As the video touched on, this reform that moved California toward a locally controlled, risk-based juvenile justice system that relies heavily on data and evidence-based programs is working. We do not only see the incredible outcomes for youth, the changed lives, the generational impacts to their family, but we see the incredible outcomes for safety in our community. To us, this proves without a doubt this was a smart investment by the state, the dividends of which are not just financial in nature, but in authentic human impact that remains immeasurable. In short, the investment to the local juvenile justice system has worked. I would now like to introduce the Sacramento County Chief Probation Officer, Lee Sill, who will introduce our next speaker.
Good morning. All right, let's waste no time. It's time to get down to the details of exactly what we're talking about. What is this thing, juvenile realignment? We're talking about it in big terms. We're looking at it over a decade. In fact, it has precedents that come before it and legislation that comes after it. But at its simplest form, juvenile realignment really comes down to legislation that was passed in 2007 as part of the California State Budget Act. It passed unanimously, nearly unanimously. Congressman Tom McClintock, he can't vote in favor of a budget act. Nearly unanimously, though. Took effect August 24th, 2007, and then went into effect just days later, September 1, 2007. Had almost no registered opposition whatsoever. What did it do? Well, it accomplished three big things. First of all, it restricted prospectively the intake to the State Department of Juvenile Justice any serious, violent, or sex offenders. And anyone who didn't fall into that category, youth who had committed non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offenses, those would prospectively remain at the local level, managed by county probation departments. Secondly, it prospectively restricted juvenile parole to those same populations, serious offenders, violent offenders, and sex offenders. And again, prospectively returned to county probation jurisdiction any youthful offender coming out of the State Department of Juvenile Justice who didn't fall into one of those categories. And third, and perhaps most importantly, it provided funding and support for counties to innovate in the area of juvenile justice. Now, many of these things were underway already, but it provided one more significant incentive for counties to engage in risk and needs assessment, as we've already heard this morning, evidence-based practices, data collection, and it actually provided financial support in the form of block grants, what we call today the Youthful Offender Block Grant, to counties. Meaningful money, real money for counties to actually do these things, to take over these new responsibilities and incentivize all of these best practices. So there you have it. That's juvenile realignment. But of course, that really doesn't tell us much of anything. We didn't come here to learn just that. As I mentioned, much came before it, much has come after. And more importantly, what is the context for this significant legislation, this budget legislation that snuck through in 2007? What is the impact of this legislation? How were counties successful? Were they successful in implementing it? Was the state successful in downsizing its State Department of Juvenile Justice? And then what about the communities? What were the impacts in public safety and in crime? Well, we've heard a little bit, but we're going to see a little bit more. Here in Sacramento County, when these responsibilities were returned to us, we expected to see our local population in our juvenile halls and our ranch at the time, we expected to see them balloon. But in the 10 years since then, we've seen exactly the opposite happen. Today, we have 1/3 the number of youth incarcerated as we did 10 years ago. What happened? How did that happen? With all these youth now being served in the community, we would surely see crime spike, at least a little bit, right? We would prepare ourselves for that. But that didn't happen either. And that's not just Sacramento County. These are the impacts we see statewide. We see this recurring in all counties, north and south, inland, and on the coast. So we're here today because we want to understand what happened. And we have no better person positioned in the world to tell us what happened. We're here with Nancy Campbell, who was the special master at the outset of the litigation against the State Department of Juvenile Justice before SB 81 passed. And she was there all the way until the end last year, 2016, when it came to its successful resolution. She's been a partner with 2 governors, the legislature, advocates, the court, and most importantly, all of us, correctional professionals, to institute this significant reform in California. Before that, she served as the executive director of a domestic violence shelter. Soon after that, she served as the first female of a local county residential program, and then became, in Colorado, the first woman to head Colorado's Department of Parole, their Department of Community Corrections, including minimum security institutions. She later performed that same role in Washington, at the time going on to win numerous accolades for her innovations throughout the state of Washington. And then her career culminated, of course, as would the career of any correctional professional, when she became the head of a local juvenile probation department, right? Today, She is an assistant professor in the state of Washington. She's also the principal for Campbell Consulting. She works with populations all over the world, most recently all over Africa. We are very lucky to have her with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nancy Campbell.
Thanks, Lee. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. It's like coming home in an interesting sort of way. But you know, as I was watching that video, I thought I'm going to give you all the history and the context of so much that went into this thing called realignment, because it didn't happen with the passage of just one piece of legislation. There's a long history. And then I watched that video and I said, oh, there really was one moment that caused realignment. So I'm going to tell a story about a colleague. And those of you at DJJ, you can tell Mike I did this. But this is my beloved colleague, Michael Miner, who was really a great leader in reform at DJJ. But he tells the story of when Governor Schwarzenegger came to visit DJJ, that he was the head of security at the time. And by mistake, you know, they carry their OC on their hip. By mistake, in getting out of the car, he managed to mace the governor. And not only did he do it once, he managed to then, in his panic, do it again. So quite honestly, I think it probably was that moment when the Terminator was maced that alignment was a given. Seriously, I want to do a couple things in this brief time we have together, because I think it's terribly important to understand the history, so some of the good things you can carry forward, but so that in this time, that for someone like me looks a lot like years ago, you don't have the backsliding that has occurred at different points in history when we've had great innovations. And I'll tell you, when Karen said, you know, oh, she's feeling a little old here, my big discovery in preparing for this is that I am old. And you know, you'd think I would know this, but I hadn't quite figured it out. As Lee said, I do work in Africa, and I was on this trip to Zambia a few months ago, and after 23 hours, you know, you're pretty tired, and I'm on my last shuttle bus, and a young African woman jumps up, and she offers me her seat, and I think, isn't she sweet? But, you know, I don't need that. But when I started to actually look at this history and realized that the last time I was doing presentations to groups like you, computers were huge mainframes that were tucked away in rooms. What we did is we hauled our overheads up here to the overhead projector and we flipped them over and over, because there was no PowerPoint, folks. There were no laptops. And the time I so recall doing that all across the country was when there was this young researcher at the Rand Institute here. And her name was Joan Petersilia. She was working on her PhD. And she'd done this lovely study. And for someone like me, who was a probation chief at the time, it was just what we needed to prove that those who were sentenced to probation would have lower recidivism rates than those who were sentenced to prison. Nice match sample, and in these days, this is the 80s, we didn't have a lot of good data, so this study meant a lot. It particularly meant a lot because in 1976, this guy named Martinson came out with a meta-analysis that said rehabilitation does not work. One study, folks, one study. And it took off, and we suddenly were in a reactive mode trying to fight for our lives to prove that probation does work. Now that study that I ended up going around finally all over the country, there was another Californian that embargoed that study for a year. Again, I love Joan, I wasn't so fond of this guy. His name was Ronald Reagan. And his administration did everything they could to bury that research. And his administration did everything they could to promote fast-track construction. We finally got it released, and along came, you know, the overheads, and we went everywhere we could to try to tell the story of what probation is capable of doing, whether it's adult or juvenile, and we couldn't get it heard. So I want to share with you what led up to juvenile realignment, what you've done, which is remarkable, and I would agree with your AG, it is, you are number one in this. Even though you weren't the first, you did it in a way that California typically does. You were the biggest, you were the best, and it is the most remarkable. But I want you to remember, now I look out and I listen to the media and I listen to what's going on, and boy, it feels like the 1980s to me again, folks. and it worries me greatly. So I'm going to argue, I want you to really sing the song of what you've accomplished. I'm going to ask you to keep digging on the research, because it's essential that you both know your history, so you're prepared if things go south, that you have the data you need, because what you've done, I don't want to see it go away, because it's truly remarkable. So the old lady's putting her glasses on, and let's see if she can learn how to use the little flipper. Maybe, maybe not. There we go. Nope. Yep. So what strikes me that's really interesting to me is that some of you really don't know the history of juvenile corrections here in California. And see, I'm old enough that when I was in graduate school at SUNY Albany, we had all the greats there. You know, University of Pennsylvania, Berkeley had gone under, SUNY Albany, all the great researchers and all the great criminologists were pretty much in those two schools. You know, a few flung around the country. But there was this woman, Marguerite Warren, one of the few women who was actually in the field at the time academically, and she had worked for years at this place that, as a New Yorker, I'd never seen, but I kept hearing about, which was CYA. And CYA actually was, in its time, in the 60s and 70s, the most renowned juvenile system in the country. And she did a study called the California Treatment Program for 12 years, where she studied what different kinds of programs, because CYA had so many different kinds of programs at that time, what type of youth should be assigned to that program, and does it make a difference? Her research at CYA in those days is actually what is the basis and foundation for what we now call responsivity. And that all came out of California. And other people came out of California in those days, out of the juvenile system, like Ted Palmer. Ted Palmer was a great researcher that was at CYA. He was one of the guys in the vanguard that pushed back when they said rehabilitation doesn't work. And then there were guys like Alan Breed, once a superintendent at Preston. At least in my day, when you said the name Alan Breed anywhere in the United States, it was connoted to mean integrity, professionalism, the best of the best. So there was this history at one point that was so wonderful and so profoundly incredible. And then by the time I came here to be special master, it looked very different. So what happened? Not unlike something that happened not that many years before in the 1970s. In 2015, there was an obit in the Washington Post that you probably didn't notice, but Barry Grisberg did. He said, Jerry Miller was probably the greatest criminal justice reformer in both juvenile justice and adult criminal justice in the last 50 years. Anybody know who Jerry Miller is? Jerry Miller did much of what you did in Massachusetts in the 1970s. He came in and he said what was called training schools were horrific. They were hurting kids, not helping kids. It was the juvenile justice training system. And he started closing down the institutions. And he closed them down en masse. And it was, for those of us who were thankful and appreciative, we were so excited. However, within a few short years, less than a decade, all of that work had been undermined, and basically we were on a new track. Martinson comes along, nothing works. The Reagan administration comes in, and the goal there, folks, was clearly we need to incarcerate the more people for longer lengths of time. That was the goal, and we did. It was all about locking people up. And one of the things you have to remember is when in those days, if you look at this quote, we functioned on beliefs. We didn't have good data. Belief, was you went before the legislature and you tried to convince them with your heart and soul and your anecdotal data. But notice what Jerry says here. It's terribly important to remember that it's not just about the data, it is about beliefs. So we have to combine those two things when we think about what are we doing, where are we going, but belief is not enough. So, in those days, data was limited. The advocacy movement was trying to stop the abuses of juveniles. Laws had just been passed giving them some of their basic rights. Guys like Jerry Miller were being courageous and doing things that were phenomenal. Martinson comes along and says nothing works. And basically, by the 1980s, the mid-1980s, we are like the little kids with the fingers in the dike trying to stop the onslaught, which was saying probation doesn't work, parole is disappearing around the country, probation's being cut back, and we are in a reactive mode. So what happens? How do we fight this in those days, and I tell you this little bit of a story because you want to think about it in case it happens again. People fight back in a quiet way, and notice there's a diversity of people who fight back here. And they're not organized together, but they become organized. Some researchers, like your Ted Palmer, say, this isn't real. I've got data that says otherwise. So does Joan Petersilia. And then those fabulous Canadians start doing meta-analyses. They start saying, oh no, look, there actually are programs that work, and we can tell you with specificity what about them makes them work. And then we get guys like Ed Latessa, where they're developing now schools of criminal justice that just aren't research schools. They really are schools that focus on how to help us as practitioners. And guys like Ed gets out there and starts sharing his data. And if any of you, I'm sure you have heard Ed Latessa, you know that he could convince anybody of anything. He's so charming, but he's got his data. So the researchers teamed up with the practitioners and got out and about and started telling the story. And the practitioners didn't give up. Guys in the feds who, despite the fact that they were being told not to do things, said, well, we're going to kind of get out there and talk about what does work. Dave Dillinger, Kinzinger, George Kaiser, they just got out there and said, we're going to do this. They started making associations. At that time, APPA, frankly, was going under, but saved it, ICCA, and they started talking about this research stuff. And the bureaucrats combined with the researchers, combined with the practitioners, and then the foundation started funding, and then we were off and running again, showing that what was possible. So, that history to remind us that what we know is right can disappear very quickly on us. And to prevent that, we have to partner together. Community groups, labor, legislatures, we have to constantly be together, researchers, practitioners, we have to be together, united to make sure it doesn't happen again. So let's look at what does happen in the great state of California. Pre-realignment, it's not good. The good news is, at that point, you did actually have the right age of jurisdiction, which you later changed, but you had it then. There was no cost, of course, for commitments. You got to know that around the country, there were other models that actually had the cost factor built in to avoid over-institutionalization, but not here. The Juvenile Parole Board had enormous discretion. And I have to tell you, by the time I got here, years and years later, it was not a good experience to sit in a parole board hearing. It was not what we want to be doing with young people. CCPOA, of course, terribly strong. Lovely article one time in the Olympian, in the Sacramento Bee, that was talking about how they thoughtfully and carefully fought all legislation in this state that would have stopped the over-institutionalization. So they were strong advocates for that punitive model. And, for governors and prosecutors and sheriffs, it was a time in the 80s and 90s leading up to the 2000s where everybody was tough on crime. It's how you got elected. And it was going on here, of course, as well. There was high, at that point, still policymaker support for your juvenile system, even though, as the video showed, it was not doing the kinds of things we want to have done. So, that troubled state institutions, CYA, really created the context for realignment. It was a horrible thing, but it was what was necessary. The exposure of what was going on was necessary to really start the movement. So there was overcrowding, as you saw in the video, institutional violence, gangs, assaults, suicide rate was ridiculously high. Program quality, when I got there, program quality was basically whatever the supervisor of that unit liked. So if they had staff that said, hey, I think we should do Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that's what they did. If they had staff who said, I think we should do another program, that's what they did. It was very individualized, and there was no actual curriculum that had ever been reviewed to determine if, in fact, it worked. High failure rate, of course, on release, and of course, the costs were high, and the costs still are high. Costs get higher, of course, as we reduce numbers. So when I look at costs, I don't get excited by them going up. It actually may be not such a bad thing because it shows your numbers have gone down. So, how did the movement really get going? Well, the media was great. There was exposure of the problems, interviews with people. The advocacy groups were key to this. Even the advocacy groups who don't like me, I still liked what they did. The ledge staff began to wake up and say this is not okay. Certain legislators started to wake up. And then the plaintiffs, the prison law office and others, began to put pressure on the system to make change. And if there's one thing that you don't do well in California, is you don't know how to use lawsuits to your advantage, although I think you do better at the county level. When I saw a lawsuit coming, I was like, okay, bring it on, because I knew it could get me more resources. But I got rid of it and settled it and dealt with it quickly. Here, what happened is there was a lot of fighting of the PLO's desires, and of course, it led to a consent decree. A consent decree that took a long time to get implemented and resolved. So, change begins. See how early really realignment begins? It doesn't begin overnight. You know, you've got now this sliding scale fee that goes in the 90s, and then you've got your juvenile justice block grant that goes in, so there's beginning changes. 2000 brings some not good change with Prop 21, but 2004 the consent decree comes, and the consent decree was terribly important in terms of realignment. And to their credit, the department, which at that point I guess it was not CDCR yet, but the department really did a good job of actually creating amazing remedial plans. Part of the reason I said I would be the master in this case was the plans actually were trying to do the right thing, and there were 7 of them. It was daunting. It was a complete reform of the entire system. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in a lawsuit before. But really thoughtful, well done, trying to base the reforms on what we knew at that point in terms of research. Now, we'd like to all say it's all about CYA and DJJ and how they were so bad, but y'all were being sued at the county level too. You know, your detention centers weren't doing so well, some of your camps weren't doing so well, and I don't know all of them, I just threw in the ones that I remember, you know, Sacramento, San Joaquin, you got lawsuits going. And others, you almost had lawsuits, but you wisely negotiated them away. And then, of course, there was the CRIPA lawsuit for LA County. And so LA County also was under a consent decree. So, this is interesting and something to remember. This is the amazing part to me about you as Californians. You were so behind the times, folks, in terms of evidence-based practice. In the 90s, I'm doing juvenile probation in Washington State. I'm a chief. And I come to that from the adult system, and I'm shocked at how they're so backwards. They get a block grant from the state, much like you did, and they're doing things like scared straight. I mean, we knew things like that increased recidivism by that time. They're doing programs that don't even make sense. So, much to the chagrin of my colleagues, in '98, I went to the governor, who happened to be someone who I knew, and said, could you get this law passed quietly? Don't let anybody know. Not the right thing really to do, but it worked. And we built into law that in the juvenile justice system, if you got state dollars, you had to have a validated risk and needs tool. You had to have a case management system. And unlike the adult system, by the 90s, we knew what worked in terms of cognitive behavioral treatment for kids. And at UC Boulder, Del Elliott had developed the Blueprints program. So I literally said in that law, there's the 5 programs that the state will fund, they won't fund anything else. And we got the law passed. And it transformed the juvenile justice system overnight in Washington State. And that was going on all around the country. And you guys weren't even on that level yet. You weren't there. But some guys in NIC on the adult side are looking at you saying, this is not okay by the early 2000s because you really still had not come out of the Get Tough movement. That movement took such hold all across the country, and you're such a big system, it's so hard to change things here, that had not begun to change here where it had in the rest of the country. So NIC said, we're going to put money into literally getting into California probation systems and trying to change them. So I talked to some of the early consultants because I did some of the work with some of the jurisdictions, Orange, Imperial, San Luis Obispo, and please bring me back to San Luis Obispo. That's such a lovely place, and the wine is so good. But we went into these jurisdictions with the leadership team in the probation department, including juvenile, to start to teach about evidence-based practice. And then Karen, Megan says hi. I talked to Megan, one of your consultants at the time, who worked with you for years. On the adult side, you really began to push into the implementation of evidence-based practices. And what I love that you did is you use CPOC as a resource. As one of the presenters said, you don't dictate here to the counties. You say, Kern County is different than Sacramento County, so we're going to be a resource to you, but y'all do what fits for your jurisdiction. And of course, that's the best way to make change. The good thing that started happening in juvenile here is the JDAI. How many of you were JDAI sites? Anybody remember? The sites here that were JDAI just rocked it. All of a sudden, around the country, with those grants, Santa Cruz, Sacramento, lots of you started to do amazing things of reducing your detention populations and really pushing out and partnering with community vendors as well as your staff to have community options. So what's a little different for you is many states were much more unified in how they approach things, and you were more compartmentalized. I would argue that makes for better long-term change. I would argue that that was the better strategy. When you impose it from the state, it's never well received at the local level. So, the last bullet here about it's really too bad the adult system doesn't learn from y'all. You know, I've sat many times, you're gonna have some great people here tomorrow, Scott Kernan and others from CDCR, and said, look at what we did in the juvenile system. Look at how you could change the way you think about force. And it's just really hard to convince folks in the adult system that somehow the juvenile work matters, even though the kids are much harder to work with because of where they are developmentally. You know, it's a much more challenging thing to work with juveniles than adults, especially in institutions, but they just have a hard time getting their mind around it. But we know that all of the adult innovations started in the juvenile system. Work release, parole, in the early days, in the 1900s, all of those innovations started with the work you do. So keep going, because there's lots of things you can teach the adult systems. Now, so here's when realignment really hits. So what is it? What did the law do? Well, the most important thing, as has been said by Lee, is you banned the state commitments of nonviolent juveniles. And that's huge. All of a sudden, and of course, you know, there's a lot of worry at the time this law went through that y'all weren't going to be able to handle this. And boy, if you proved them wrong, you handled it well. You phased out the nonviolent offenders. You created the block grant, and I love the fact that that money has stayed. And I suspect after 10 years, they can't take it away from you, and you got to keep expanding it, because if there's one thing I know is that we never fully fund probation. I mean, I always argue that we still really haven't shown what probation can do because we've never chosen to fully fund it. So I'm glad to hear that at least it's sticking around. I hope it's going to continue to grow. So more changes, though, occur. The law goes through, and let's look at the things that start to happen. And then we'll go back and look at some of the outcomes of this. So by 2010, there's almost no progress in the lawsuit against CYA, now DJJ. And rightfully so. Advocacy groups and others are losing their minds saying, how can this be? Not to mention the court. That's actually when I came on the scene as the master. And we had to make a few changes, fire a few people, move some things around, you know, get clear that we're really going to do something here, and we did. And let me just say that it was often because of the leadership of DJJ, people like Mike Miner, that these changes occurred. Their staff were phenomenal, they were committed, and they made these things happen. The Juvenile Parole Board then gets realigned. People were very nervous about this. You know, now the new conditions, violators go back to you. Everything should always stay local. We know that. The more you keep things local, the more effective you are. But this was very scary for the state system. And notice 2012, and it might have been 13. I keep going back and forth and couldn't quite figure this out. But this little thing about time ads and in the state system being eliminated. All of us tend, and I'm going to talk for a little bit about this whole notion of the two models, moral accountability and behavior change, you know, that all of us think we need a hammer to make change. And oh, people were worried when those time ads were going to go away, because what a time ad was, kid screws up when in the institution, you extend their time. And when that tool went away, not only did it not cause any problems, but it was the impetus, really, I believe, to help the kind of change that was needed by the staff to find new tools to actually interact and work differently with kids. So, you've got your age of jurisdiction that dropped. Unfortunately, I'm hoping you can fix that and make it go back up. And then your fee was a little bit too expensive, so you changed that. What's amazing to me is the role you've been on since 2016. You know, not sure yet what Prop 57 quite means for the juvenile system at the state level or for you, but it looks like it's going to have some good outcomes, looks like it's moving in the right direction. And then look at 2017. It's like this flurry of legislation that does all the right things. You know, sealing records, assessment of fees on families going away, just a plethora of good forward motion. And I'm going to tell you, in large part, that's because you have this fabulous governor, Jerry Brown, and when he comes in tomorrow, I tell you, be on your feet, Don't act like you're from San Francisco. Act like you're from Kern County. Hoot, holler, scream, and yell, because that man, he's no moonbeam, he's a sunbeam. He's done more to help you move things forward and change things. Just a remarkable, remarkable governor. So, what are the outcomes? What have we actually achieved? Because, of course, here's what the worries were. Oh, we're going to move kids to the locals. Well, they're going to fall through the cracks. And, of course, their detention centers are going to grow, the camps are going to grow. You know, it's just going to be a mess. And, oh, we're going to see this reduction of the state facilities, but what are we going to do with the kids who really need help when we get rid of those facilities? Lots of fears, fears that really didn't play out. So, here's just a little overview of the downsizing of DJJ and what caused, as you saw in that earlier slide, that drop from over 11,000, and you'll see now they run about 650 kids in any given day. And I can tell you, at one point, the mental health expert and I went through every single case of every single kid when they had about 900 kids. And I was looking for lightweights because I thought they would still be there. There aren't any. You are sending the right kids to the state. You are sending the kids that absolutely, if you tried to hold them in your community at this point in time with the resources you have, it would be very difficult. Politically, it would be difficult. Hopefully that can change down the line. So, here's what I think is key to this. We have good data now, but we also have to always remember that this change comes with a philosophy change. And I struggled when I was the master to get the DJJ staff to understand what this was. So I came up with a label. I call it the moral accountability model versus the behavior change model or a behavioral health model. What's the difference? Well, moral accountability assumes that kids can be held accountable, that in fact they know that they did something wrong and that we need to hold them accountable, right? And then I think about that, and I think about my years as a parent. I'm sure you've gone through this too with my teenage daughter. And when I would tell her to do something, and then she wouldn't follow through, and then I would even do things like say, now repeat after me. I just told you to do this. And then literally she'd space it out. I couldn't figure it out. So I called a parent coach and said, what's going on? And she gave me an image that's never left me about youth brain development. And I know you're going to talk about this also in the course of the couple days. She said, Nancy, a kid's brain during the teenage years is like a radio with static blasting. And every once in a while, a message that's understandable comes through. And the rest of the time, you're back to static. And it meant everything to me as a parent, because I suddenly went, oh, she's not being a brat. She literally doesn't remember. Or she heard it and she doesn't, it's just gone because of all that static. And that helped me to realize that when we say we have to prove that this kid, we have to have this kid be held accountable, it's a tough thing to do with that adolescent brain. So what we do, and what they were doing at DJJ, is you did not get punished if you followed the rules. That was the methodology for change. Don't punish if you follow the rules. And what we know from healthcare for decades is that is not, it's a very weak way of changing behavior. The stronger way, of course, is positive reinforcement. So the rules were not based on science, but they were based on individual belief. Every staff person pretty much at DJJ had a different belief system. Why? They all had different parents. They all came in with a different sense of how you parent a kid, and that's what was driving the program. And the rules, so therefore, would vary from staff member to staff member. And critically here, treatment is something you go off to, not something that is part of the living experience. So instead of having everybody, custody staff, treatment staff, management staff, the janitors, everyone, knowing what the treatment model is and engaging in it and using the same language, it was bifurcated. So a kid would go off to treatment, be told to act in one way, and then come back and watch an adult do the exact opposite. Worse, watch an adult do something abusive to them and to friends. So that model wasn't working. To shift to that behavioral health model is a tricky thing, because now you have to have an underlying theoretical model. So in Washington State, for example, in their juvenile state system, they're over 20 years now drilling onto dialectical behavior therapy. They've stuck with the model, they keep pushing that model, and of course now everybody has the same perspective, everybody understands what we're talking about, and so the level of change becomes much easier. The other thing, of course, we know is you have to use evidence-based programs. Very tough thing for staff when you say you have to follow this curriculum. There's this thing called fidelity. And they don't really want to do that. You have to follow the curriculum. So it's a hard shift. The other thing, of course, is that the rewards have to be good enough that a kid wants to follow them. These kids are influenced, of course, tremendously by their peers, so you better have some darn good rewards that are influential enough in their lives that they're going to want to make change. And of course, all staff engage, and then, as Alan said in the intro, data has to guide everything. You have to create the data systems where you're able to show your staff and to look at for your own self, is it working? And that has to be the day-to-day data, and it also has to be the long-term data. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about intermediate measures and why it's terribly important that you all have got your data traps set up, because when people push back and tell you what you're doing is not right, you have to have, we don't have the recidivism data yet, so we have to have the intermediate data. So let's look at the good news ever so briefly. As has been said, the court commitments to DJJ drop precipitously. I mean, you just, down they go. This, to me, this slide, I got this from Lee. I said, tell me about the transfers to adult court. This speaks not just to your data, this speaks to how you're practicing, folks, because we know how this works in local probation. Those decisions to put someone in the adult system as a kid come from your district attorney, come from your judges, come from your public defenders. This says to me that you all are out there influencing them. You are talking to them, you are changing their opinions, because they would not be dropping at this level, even with all the other good work. So here's where that belief system combines with that data. You go in and you both share your belief packed with data, and you're changing the perceptions of the system players. This slide to me is just 100% proof that that's what you're doing, and I encourage you to keep it up. The other thing, of course, was, oh, they're going to fill up the camps, they're going to fill up the detention centers. Look, you didn't. Now, there's some research that needs to be done around this. You need to look at the population demographics, which I did not do, so that you can counter what will be said, which is, oh, well, you know, the youth population is declining or something of that sort. So make sure you've got that. But as Lee said, at the time when you're getting increased kids, higher risk kids on your caseloads, you're not holding them in detention centers as long. That's remarkable. To me, that is an incredible statement about realignment has worked in the most profound way, which is that it has changed the behavior of your staff. It has changed the behavior of the other players in the criminal justice system. And I'm quite confident that the change for them was because of you. Now, this is DJJ, looking from about 2010. So they're holding somewhere about the 600s. And if you look around the country, folks, other systems are trying to get rid of their state institutions, much like you have tried to. But no one can look at a 40 million population and have 600 kids, that's it, or 650 in state institutions. This is remarkable, and it's been holding for years. I mean, I kept thinking it was going to pop back up. I thought, the counties are going to get frustrated, and they're going to just start popping it up. What it says to me is, you have been developing alternatives and other resources to handle these higher risk kids. That you have been figuring out methods and ways to keep them where they should be, which is in their communities. So good on you. Just showing a couple little things about DJJ. You know, used to have all kinds of kids on suicide watch. This particular slide shows that they don't anymore. It's dropping tremendously, and this is largely because they've really built a very good mental health system. They have good mental health practitioners. They have good mental health curricula, and they really don't have. One of the challenges we had with them is helping them understand who's actually mentally ill and who's just acting out. And the mental health population is tiny there now. Because what would happen, and it happens with you too, is we got a kid who's really difficult, they're acting out, so we say, I gotta get them off my unit, get them to mental health, right? So they were dumping them. When we finally got good risk and needs in there, good kinds of assessment processes, then they were able to say, oh, these kids really aren't mentally ill, and oh, by the way, what that means, y'all in your units have to learn how to deal better with difficult kids. You're not gonna pass the buck. We have the same thing on field caseloads. Most important, discipline. DJJ, when I got there, was a frightening place to be. Kids, you know, depending upon where you were, I will never forget being at Ventura Youth Correctional Facility, taking the judge on a tour, and we walked into what you would consider sort of the SHU treatment unit, and the kids were all in their underwear. They had nothing in their cells except for mattresses. They were so smart, though, with nothing. They were still managing to light fires. They had figured out how to rewire the electrics in the cells with nothing else to do. But it was just horrifying to see what had been done with these kids. So what this slide shows us is that the disciplinary decline is significant. You know, it used to be people would say they'd wheeled out those discipline actions quickly. Now they don't. Use of force was a critical problem. Use of force there has dropped by about 60% over time. There would be times when, you know, the chief in the different units would tell me that they'd never, ever have months where there was no use of force. Now it happens regularly, where there'll be a whole couple months that go by and they've never used force on a kid. And they use it only judiciously and where they should. They have a fabulous review process now, a process that doesn't say, did we use force properly, but asks the question, should we ever have used force here? And if not, what should we have done differently? So it's become a learning process for staff about how to act differently. There was a unit, this what sort of is their SHU, called the Behavior Treatment Unit. This is where kids would be sent to stay if they were really troubled. When I got there, the kids sometimes were there for over 2 and 3 years, and they were in their cells over 23 hours a day. That's all changed now. And people don't want to hear this, because when they say there is still isolation of youth in the California system, I tell them it is not true. That is not true. There is no such thing anymore. All the kids, they're in, this unit now is being turned into the ER of the DJJ system. It's viewed as when a kid's really having problems, they come here and you give them not less but more treatment, you give them not less but more interaction, and these kids basically now stay very short-term stays. I was looking at a snapshot the other day, the youngest facility, OH, where they have the youngest kids, no kids have been there for more than 60 days in years. They just get them in, get them out, get them in, get them out. And that's what they're supposed to do. Where they have the older kids and more challenging, instead of seeing kids that are in there for 300 and some days, we see kids now that are in there for typically 60 to 90 days. I saw a couple that were there for 120, 240. Sometimes what happens with those kids is when they're gonna be released, they start to decompensate, they start to go down, so they let them stay in that unit and actually parole them from there because they don't want them to fall apart, they wanna help them. But basically, the change in this is incredible. The kids, if they're in the unit, still go to school, they go to treatment. You know, if they're a graduate, they find other things for them to do, but they're out and about and engaged. They're not anymore sitting in a cell isolated. So it's a remarkable change, and hopefully one that will continue. I know that they're looking at their data constantly and trying to improve all the time. The other thing they did is that they made it so that if you have a kid that goes to this unit, you go with them. In other words, the case manager has to go with and visit them every day. So they created workload, if you will, for people, so they can't just dump a kid. And so the staff now are very judicious in when they send a kid there, because it means they're going to put a lot of time and energy leaving their unit, going to that unit, and it eats away at their time. What substantially changed the system, which people resisted, was the notion of positive reinforcement. And we started this program in the BTP, this treatment unit that held the kids who were the most difficult. And you have to understand, at this time, I literally had the plaintiff and the defendant trying to convince me that we needed a super BTP. We needed to take these kids that they simply couldn't figure out what to do with and put them in something even higher custody, which we would have had to have built to do it. And I simply said, you're wrong. You haven't tried yet a true behavioral treatment program. So our mental health expert came in and he created a program of reinforcers. And we started with candy. And of course I got called the candy lady. It's not gonna work, these guys are tough. Well, in fact, a couple of months later you go in and the staff are saying, you know, Nancy, these kids say please and thank you now. It's very strange. And you know, Nancy, these kids will go in the day room with other gangs now. Well, over time, they learned, and this was the beginning, that yes, in fact, when we reinforce the positive, when we reinforce the behavior that approximates what we want, we get better change. And that is a system now that is everywhere throughout the state institutions, and every day they're counting positive checks. They're counting and saying, who's given how many positive checks? And they not only do it at an aggregate level, but they look at which staff. And as you can see here, support staff, custody staff are lower, treatment staff being the highest, and education in the middle. So this tells you, if you're the manager of the unit, who's not participating in this program? Who's not using positive reinforcement? What do I need to do to change? So that system has worked, and now they're seeing constant progression of the kids across what is also their level system. So you have to have some system that changes the behavior of the staff and the units, of course, and they've managed to do that. Now, just very briefly, 25, 30 girls you send to them, they're all very challenging kids. And boy, were there problems in the beginning, and this was true for boys as well. Kids would basically say, act out in school, and then they'd send them back to their unit. Well, they figured out, the experts, that no, we'll create another program for them they have to go to, not make this appealing, and notice how few absences there now are for girls in school. They created a separate school for them, they've created alternatives for them, and now these very troubled kids are graduating. Same thing is true across behavior reports. Look at 2016. There's almost no behavior reports coming across from girls. And you know, I love working with girls, but you will hear anywhere on probation, in detention, in a camp, in the state system, girls are harder to work with. They're so difficult. This is proof that they're not. Girls are different. They require a different skill set from staff, but they are remarkably doing well. And it's one of those sad things where the state institution has developed this expertise because it simply doesn't exist in most places. Unexcused absences across the board. This is one institution, down less than 10%. Your state public school system, because we looked at this, runs probably about 15% in your public schools. They've managed to go lower, and that's something that they should be doing. So the real question is, this all sounds really good, but is it real? Are the trends holding? And here's your data, of course, that shows your trends are holding. You know, the felony arrest rates are declining. And again, if you compare that to the actual population decline of the crime-prone age, it's still declining at a rate that is greater than what it should be. So this shows that this has worked. Another quick slide to look at to see how much it's changed. I mean, that change in 10 years is unlike anything I think any other state system can see. I mean, what you've done, both at the state system and in county probation, is remarkable. Misdemeanors, same thing. You know, so we want to make sure that we've got both misdemeanors and felonies dropping, that we're not changing and shifting, and you're not. Here's what is most heartening to me. When, in the early 2000s, when folks were coming in, including myself, trying to talk to you about evidence-based practices, you were a decade behind. You are now so far ahead of the game, it's unbelievable. The programs that you have are all the critical programs, and again, when I look at how they're spread, they're different across counties, and that's okay. You're using what you should in your local community to the best ability that you can. And the fact that you've got these programs, look at this in terms of ART, how often you're using it. You know, interactive journaling. You're using all evidence-based programs. What you're also doing, interestingly to me, is you're doing it both in the community and in custody. So my hope is that you're creating a continuum, you know, where you start a CBT program in detention or in a camp that then you can transfer to outside. That's really tough to do. My guess is you're on the beginning end of that, you know, the beginning part of that spectrum, but you really need to figure out how to do that so that can continue. Now, what's interesting to me also is you've done a good job of partnering with your community-based organizations. But that is not to say that you're also not having your staff deliver programs. And I'm a big believer that you need to do both. You need to do both. Your staff have to deliver these programs, otherwise they don't have the language, they don't understand what's going on. Otherwise, in probation, you're doing what we do in the institutions, send the kid to treatment, but act differently. You have to be sending the kid to treatment, but you really have to know that treatment program. So when I'm working with him or her, I can really make sure that what I'm doing with them aligns with what they're getting in treatment. So DJJ is using similar programs to you. You know, obviously there's a smaller cut than what you're using, but basically the same ones. And then the recidivism rate issue. This, of course, is the big kahuna, isn't it? So what do we know? Well, we don't know much yet. DJJ, the good thing is the CDCR is committed to having a recidivism study done every year. They've just done their first one, and it basically looks at the 2011 to 12 cohort. So that's so early on in their development of their integrated behavioral treatment model that really we would not expect a reduction in recidivism, and they don't show it. What they show is basically about a 30%. What they're measuring is return to DJJ and return to CDCR DAI within 3 years, which is the right thing to measure. They shouldn't be looking at arrests because really kids drop off after arrests. You know, some of them are resolved. 30%, 37%, it's not great, right? But it's also not bad. It means a good 60% are still doing okay. The question is, what will happen in the next, I would say probably not the next study, but the study when you start to show kids about 2015, 2016, that will start to tell the tale of did it work? And the same thing's true for probation. You've got to start having studies that show recidivism down the road. But now you have to work on intermediate measures. Now you have to be able to show all the intermediate predictors of recidivism. So you want to show completion of the CBT. You want to show completion of education. You want to show reduction of violence in your camps, reduction of use of force, all those things that are the intermediate measures. That's what we've got now. That's what we have to talk about now. But we have to keep on marching on that, really being able to drill down and study the ultimate outcome, which is recidivism reduction, because that's what this is all about, right? So, here's my worry. We're in a time when I listen to the rhetoric coming out of the federal government, it's at best confusing, at worst to me it's frightening. When I listen to Jeff Sessions, I hear get tough on crime. I'm hoping that your legislators, your local boards of supervisors are more sophisticated. They aren't going to fall for this again. But I didn't think in the 80s they'd fall for it as hard as they did. And they really did. So I would say to you now, you need to really be working with people to make sure that what's coming down from the feds is not listened to. Your state leadership is more important than ever. Your local leadership is more important than ever. The other thing I would say is, you know, there's been a little bit of pointing fingers in this whole realignment movement. Oh, you didn't do that, you didn't do this, that. You know, no. You really need to relish what you've done, you know, celebrate what you've done. But remember that you got here because everybody was involved. It was the advocates, it was probation, it was the governor, it was DJJ, it was everybody together saying, we can do this. And everybody didn't arrive at the same moment in agreement, but ultimately you did it. So you've got to really continue to keep that partnership. I would argue that you should start considering those DJJ facilities are terrible. It's time to get something else. Why don't the county and state partner? Create nice little 40, 50 bed facilities out in different regions around the state. Why don't you, before Governor Brown leaves, say, Governor, could you get something in that budget that would give us something where kids stay closer to their communities? They're in a treatment setting that looks like it should, a real treatment setting instead of basically a prison. You know, it's a big step, but it's the right step. And I know some folks would like to say there should never be state institutions, but, you know, if I'm a district attorney, that's a hard sell. I don't know that I can sell that. I need some higher level institution, but it could be around the state. The other thing I would say is you've done a good job of figuring out how to solve this conundrum of you got rid of juvenile parole and you rely on probation, but there's still a gap there. I know that Danette Bowen and some others are going to speak to you about the work that they do, where they collaborate with you, but I think there's a work that still needs to be done to tighten up that handoff when kids come out of DJJ and they come to you. Get your intermediate measures, line them up, talk to them, try to get the press interested. It's hard, but try to get your recidivism data and tell the story through the positive victories. I love the videos you have right now. There's a thing on PBS called Brief But Spectacular, and we worked with CDCR to get a story on there about young men 18 to 25 and what they're learning and what they're growing, and it got amazing reception. One of the best in that series has had, I think, 50 different shows, so you can get those stories out there. Last, I would say, again, when the governor walks in, don't wait to clap. Stand on your feet, scream and yell, let him know. Listen to what your AG just said, let him know how much it matters that he's on your side. Get to those advocacy groups that maybe criticize you, maybe they don't, but partner with them because they help move this forward. Labor did a great job with DJJ in the end. They were wonderful partners in helping making some of the reforms that were needed and getting officers on board with it. So get to labor. Your boards of supervisors, make sure you're doing everything you can with them. And boy, you better thank CPOC. I went on the dashboard and I was like a kid in a candy store. I couldn't believe it. You can just sit there and push buttons and you can get all this interesting information and it's all right there. I don't know of another system that does that. It's phenomenal. And here it is. CPOC did it for you. So, last but not least, remember you've got the greatest motivator of any sector in terms of people who want to work for you. You have purpose. You have, I'm making a difference. And what we know about the motivational research is it's never money that motivates. It's nice to you have to make enough money that you're satisfied in life, but the true motivators of what changes behavior and what causes people to stay longer hours, hustle a little harder, it's all about that they feel like they're making a difference. So you need to remind people in your staff, in the community, how they're making a difference. And the thing that's most important, particularly for those of you here in management, is you have to practice parallel process. Parallel process is where we are modeling what we're asking them to do with the kids. The way we interact with our staff is we are using motivational interviewing. We're using responsivity. If we model that, then they can do the same. So I would say this in closing, that you are number one. You're number one in the way that you came from behind, guys. You came from behind and you just went whizzing past everybody else. What you've done in terms of realignment, you have proven that kids should stay local. You have proven that if you get the resources, not that you have enough, but that if you get the resources, you can develop programs that are evidence-based, that produce results. It is not to say the game is over. You have a lot of work ahead of you, but you have proven what we have always known, and that is that it is better to use the services of your local community, particularly for juveniles, but for adults as well, if you want to reduce recidivism. So folks, congratulations, you've done a great job. Keep up the good work, have fun and celebrate. Namaste.